There are places in this world that exist beyond the reach of maps, beyond the memory of those who once walked their paths, beyond even the fading whispers of time itself. These are the lands where silence has become a living thing, where the wind carries no voice but its own, where the stones remember what the world has long forgotten. And sometimes, when sleep draws near, and the weight of waking life begins to soften at the edges, we find ourselves drifting toward these forgotten places, as though some part of us has always known the way, as though some quiet corner of our soul has been waiting patiently to return. Tonight, I want to take you to such a place, a land that stretches beneath a sky so vast it seems to hold the entire weight of eternity within its pale blue expanse. A land of ruins and silence, of mountains that rise like sleeping giants against the horizon, of plains so wide and empty that the very concept of distance loses its meaning. This is a land that has no name anymore, for the tongues that once spoke it have long since turned to dust, and the hearts that once beat with love for this soil have faded into the endless dream that waits for all of us at the end of our journey. I remember this place not as one remembers a story told by another, but as one remembers a dream that felt more real than waking. I remember the weight of the sword upon my back, ancient and heavy with purpose. I remember the warmth of my horse beneath me, her breath steady and true, her hooves carrying us forward through lands that seem to exist outside of time itself. And I remember the reason I came to this forbidden place, the reason I crossed the great bridge that separated the world of the living from this realm of forgotten gods and sleeping titans. I came for love. I came for loss. I came because there was nothing left in the world behind me, and everything I had ever wanted lay somewhere in the silence ahead. My name does not matter now. Names are such fragile things, are they not? They belong to the waking world, to the world of introductions and farewells, of letters written and voices calling across crowded rooms. But here, in this land of shadow and stone, names dissolve like morning mist beneath the first pale light of dawn. What matters is not what I was called, but what I carried within me. And what I carried was a grief so vast, so heavy, so consuming that it had become the only thing I knew how to feel anymore. She lay wrapped in white cloth upon the back of my horse, still and silent as the land itself. Her face was peaceful, as though she were merely sleeping, as though at any moment she might open her eyes and smile at me with that warmth that had once made the entire world feel like home. But she did not open her eyes. She had not opened them for many days now, and with each passing hour, the terrible truth of her stillness pressed deeper into my chest, like a blade that would not be removed. They told me there was nothing to be done. The priests, the healers, the wise ones who spoke in measured tones and offered their condolences with practiced grace. They told me that death was final, that the boundary between the living and the gone was absolute, that I must learn to accept what could not be changed. But I could not accept it. I would not accept it, for how can one accept the absence of the very thing that gave meaning to one's existence? How can one simply nod and turn away when the light that illuminated every corner of one's life has been extinguished without warning, without reason, without mercy? And so I learned of this place. I learned of it through whispered legends and forbidden texts, through conversations held in shadowed corners with those who trafficked in knowledge that proper society preferred to forget. They spoke of a land beyond the great bridge, a land where the old gods had been sealed away long ago, a land where power still lingered in the bones of the earth and in the bodies of creatures so vast that they could reshape the very mountains with their movements. They spoke of a temple at the heart of this land, and of a voice that could be heard within its sacred halls, a voice that belonged to something ancient and unknowable, something that had existed before the first humans drew breath and would continue to exist long after the last human returned to dust. This voice, they said, could restore what had been lost. This power, they whispered, could reach across the boundary that separated life from death and pull a soul back from the darkness. But the price, they warned, was not something that could be measured in gold or years or ordinary sacrifice. The price was something else entirely, something that could only be understood by those who had already made their choice and set their feet upon the path. I did not care about the price. What was there left for me to lose? She was gone, and without her, I was nothing but an empty vessel moving through a world that had lost all color, all warmth, all meaning. If there was even the smallest chance that I could bring her back, that I could see her smile again, that I could hear her voice calling my name across a sunlit meadow, then I would pay any price, bear any burden, face any darkness that stood in my way. And so I came to the bridge. The bridge stretched before me like a ribbon of stone laid across an impossible chasm, so long that its far end vanished into the haze of distance, so high that the land below was nothing but a blur of shadow and suggestion. The wind howled around us as we crossed, my horse's hooves echoing against the ancient stone with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my heart. I did not look down. I did not look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the pale light that glowed at the end of the bridge, the light that promised answers, that promised power, that promised the impossible miracle I had crossed half the world to find. The temple rose from the center of the land, like a monument to forgotten ages, its columns reaching toward the sky with a dignity that time had not diminished. Grass grew between the stones of its courtyard, and birds nested in the crevices of its walls. But there was nothing of decay about it, nothing of ruin. It simply existed as it had always existed, as it would always exist, long after the memory of those who built it had faded from the world entirely. I carried her inside. I carried her up the long stairs and through the great doors that stood open as though they had been waiting for my arrival. I carried her past the rows of carved figures that lined the walls, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, their names and stories lost to the silence that had claimed them. And I carried her to the altar at the heart of the temple, a simple platform of stone that seemed to glow with a faint inner light, as though the very air around it was somehow different from the air that filled the rest of this hollow world. I laid her down upon the stone as gently as I would lay a sleeping child into their bed. I arranged the white cloth around her so that she looked comfortable, peaceful, as though she were resting in a garden on a warm afternoon, rather than lying upon an altar in a temple at the edge of existence. And then I knelt beside her, and I waited. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It filled the temple like water filling a vessel, like light filling a room when the curtains are drawn back to reveal the morning sun. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was simply a voice, vast and ancient and utterly without emotion, speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and arrive directly in the center of my understanding. It called itself Dorman. It told me that it had been watching me since I first set foot upon the bridge, that it had sensed the weight of my grief and the depth of my determination. It told me that yes, it possessed the power to restore life to the dead, to reach across the boundary that separated this world from whatever lay beyond, and pull a soul back into the light of existence. But the power required to perform such a miracle was not something Dorman could simply wield at will. Long ago, the people of this land had grown afraid of Dorman's power, and they had divided that power into 16 pieces and sealed each piece within the body of a great creature, a Colossus, a titan of stone and fur and ancient magic that now wandered the empty places of this land in eternal, dreamless slumber. If I wished to restore my beloved to life, Dorman said, I must first release the power that had been sealed away. I must seek out each of the 16 Colossi. I must climb their vast bodies and find the sigils that mark the locations where the power was bound. And I must use the ancient sword I carried, the sword that had been crafted specifically for this purpose in ages past, to pierce those sigils and release the fragments of Dormin's essence back into the world. It would not be easy, Dormin warned. The Colossi were not evil, but they were dangerous, and they would not simply allow me to approach without resistance. Each one would be different from the last. Each one would require me to think and observe and adapt, and each one would test me in ways I could not yet imagine. But if I succeeded, if I managed to fell all 16 of the great creatures and release all 16 fragments of the sealed power, then Dormin would fulfill its promise. My beloved would open her eyes once more. She would breathe. She would live. And all of this loss, all of this grief, all of this desperate journey across forgotten lands would finally have meaning. I did not hesitate. I did not ask questions about consequences or costs. I simply rose to my feet, took the ancient sword in my hand, and walked out of the temple into the pale light of day. My horse was waiting for me in the courtyard, patient and calm as she had always been, as though she understood exactly what we were about to undertake and had accepted it with the quiet grace that defined her nature. I mounted her back, turned my face toward the vast emptiness that stretched in every direction, and began to ride. The land unfolded around me like a dream remembered in fragments. There were forests here, dark and quiet, their trees so ancient that their bark had turned to something closer to stone than wood. There were deserts of pale sand that shifted and whispered beneath the wind like living things. There were lakes so still and clear that they reflected the sky with perfect precision, creating the illusion that one was riding not across land, but through an endless expanse of blue and white and gold. There were canyons carved deep into the earth, their walls striped with layers of color that told the story of geological ages beyond human comprehension. And there were ruins everywhere, scattered across the landscape like the discarded toys of giants, structures that had once served purposes now forgotten, monuments to civilizations that had risen and fallen, and been swallowed by the silence that claimed all things in the end. But I did not stop to wonder at any of it. I did not pause to contemplate the beauty or the mystery or the profound sadness that seemed to seep from every stone and shadow of this abandoned realm. I had a purpose, and that purpose drove me forward with a relentless momentum that left no room for anything else. I held my sword up to the sunlight and watched as beams of focused radiance gathered along its blade, converging into a single point of brilliant intensity that pointed the way toward my first quarry. Somewhere in the distance, somewhere beyond the hills and valleys and ancient forests, the first Colossus waited, and I would find it. I would climb it. I would drive my blade into its sigil and watch the light drain from its eyes. And then I would move on to the next, and the next, and the next, until all 16 had fallen, and my beloved drew breath once more. The first Colossus dwelt in a valley of broken pillars, a place where the ruins of some great structure lay scattered across the grass like the bones of a creature too vast to comprehend. I saw it before I reached the valley floor, a shape against the sky that my mind struggled to process, a form so large that it seemed to belong to a different order of existence entirely. It stood upon two legs like a man, but it was not a man. Its body was covered in fur that had turned gray and green with moss and lichen, as though it had stood in that same spot for so many centuries that the vegetation had claimed it as part of the landscape. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a mask of stone, expressionless and ancient, with eyes that glowed with a faint blue light that seemed to see everything and nothing at the same time. I dismounted from my horse at the edge of the valley and approached on foot, my heart pounding in my chest with a rhythm that seemed too fast, too loud, too alive for this land of silence and stillness. The Colossus did not seem to notice me at first. It simply stood there, swaying slightly like a tree in a gentle breeze, its great head tilted upward toward the sky, as though contemplating something far beyond the limits of mortal understanding. But as I drew closer, as my footsteps disturbed the grass that had grown undisturbed for countless years, something shifted in its demeanor. Its head turned slowly, ponderously, with a grinding sound like mountains rubbing against each other, and those glowing eyes found me, small and insignificant, standing in the shadow of its impossible bulk. It raised one foot, a foot larger than the house I had grown up in, larger than the church where I had married my beloved, larger than any single structure I had ever seen in my entire life, and it brought that foot down toward me with a force that shook the entire valley and sent me tumbling backward through the grass. I rolled, scrambled, pushed myself to my feet, and ran, not away from the Colossus, but toward it, toward the fur that hung from its leg like vines from an ancient tree, toward the handholds that I somehow knew would be there, that I somehow understood were the key to climbing this mountain of flesh and stone and ancient magic. My fingers found purchase in the coarse hair, and I began to climb. The Colossus shook and swayed, trying to dislodge me, but I held on with a grip born of desperation, born of love, born of the unshakable certainty that this was what I had been born to do, that this was the purpose that had been waiting for me all along, hidden beneath the surface of my ordinary life, until the moment when loss stripped away everything else and revealed the truth that had always been there. I climbed and climbed, pulling myself up the creature's leg, across the platform of its back, up the ridge of its spine until I reached the broad expanse of its head, where the sigil glowed with an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I raised my sword. I drove it downward into the sigil with all the strength I possessed, and the Colossus screamed. It was not a sound that could be produced by any throat of flesh and blood. It was a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself, from the sky, from the very fabric of reality that held this strange world together. It was a sound of pain and confusion and something that might have been sorrow, as though the creature could not understand why this small thing, clinging to its body, would wish to cause it harm, as though it had done nothing to deserve this violence, except exist in a form that was useful to powers beyond its comprehension. The light faded from its eyes, its great legs buckled beneath it, and slowly, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so massive, it fell. It fell like a tower crumbling, like a mountain collapsing, like the final breath leaving the body of someone you love more than life itself. It fell, and the ground shook, and dust rose in great clouds that obscured the sky. And when the dust finally settled, there was only stillness, only silence, only the vast body of the Colossus lying motionless upon the valley floor, its eyes dark, its sigil extinguished, its ancient life brought to an end by a sword in the hands of a man who had lost everything and would do anything to get it back. I stood upon its fallen head for a long moment, my chest heaving, my hands trembling, my mind struggling to process what I had just done. I had killed something ancient and innocent, something that had harmed no one, something that had simply existed in this forgotten place as it had existed for countless ages before I arrived with my grief and my sword and my desperate need. And yet I felt no guilt, no remorse, no hesitation about what came next, for somewhere in this land 15 more Colossi waited, 15 more fragments of the power I needed to restore my beloved, 15 more mountains to climb, 15 more sigils to pierce, 15 more ancient lives to end in the name of love. I climbed down from the fallen Colossus and walked back to where my horse waited at the edge of the valley. She nuzzled my hand as I approached, her dark eyes filled with a warmth and understanding that I did not deserve, but accepted gratefully nonetheless. I mounted her back, turned my face toward the pale horizon, and began to ride once more. The land seemed different after the first Colossus fell. I cannot explain exactly how or why, but there was a shift in the quality of the light, a subtle change in the way the wind moved across the grass, a faint alteration in the texture of the silence that hung over everything like a veil woven from the dreams of forgotten gods. Perhaps it was simply my imagination, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had done and what I was about to do again and again until the task was complete. Or perhaps something truly had changed. Some balance had been tipped, some ancient equilibrium disturbed by the release of the power that had been sealed within the Colossus for so many centuries. I did not know, and in truth, I did not care. All that mattered was the next sigil, the next climb, the next step on the path that would lead me back to her. I raised my sword to the sunlight once more, and watched as the beams of radiance converged along its blade, pointing the way toward the second Colossus. The light led me north, across rolling hills covered in grass that rippled like the surface of a green sea, through groves of trees whose leaves had turned gold and amber with the passage of seasons that seemed to have no connection to the calendar of the world I had left behind. I rode for what felt like hours, though time moved strangely in this land, stretching and compressing in ways that made it impossible to trust my sense of duration. The sun drifted across the sky at its own pace, unhurried and indifferent, casting shadows that lengthened and shortened with a rhythm that belonged to this place alone. The second Colossus waited for me on a great plateau overlooking the sea. I heard it before I saw it, a rhythmic pounding that shook the ground beneath my horse's hooves, a sound like the heartbeat of the earth itself made audible and overwhelming. As I crested the final hill and looked out across the plateau, I saw it there, walking slowly along the cliff's edge, its massive form silhouetted against the pale blue expanse of sky and water that stretched to the horizon. It moved on 4 legs rather than 2, its body low and broad and powerful, like a bull built on a scale that defied comprehension. Its hooves struck the ground with each step, sending tremors through the stone that I could feel in my teeth, in my bones, in the very core of my being. I dismounted and approached on foot, circling around to observe the creature from different angles, searching for the handholds and pathways that would allow me to scale its massive bulk. The fur that covered its body was darker than that of the first Colossus, almost black in places, matted and thick with age and weather. Its eyes glowed with that same faint blue light, but there was something different in the way it moved, something more alert, more aware, as though it sensed my presence and was already preparing for the confrontation it knew was coming. When it saw me, it charged. There was no warning, no moment of hesitation or confusion. It simply lowered its great head and came at me with a speed that seemed impossible for something so enormous, its hooves tearing great gouges in the earth as it bore down upon me like an avalanche of flesh and stone and ancient fury. I dove to the side at the last possible moment, feeling the rush of displaced air as the Colossus thundered past, and I landed hard on my shoulder, rolling through the grass and scrambling to my feet before the creature could turn and charge again. This was different from the first. The first Colossus had been slow, almost passive in its defense, as though it could not quite believe that something so small would dare to attack it. But this one was aggressive, relentless, driven by an instinct for self-preservation that had been honed over countless centuries of existence. It wheeled around with surprising agility and charged again, and again I dove aside, and again I felt that terrifying rush of wind and power as it passed within inches of crushing me into the earth. I needed to think. I needed to observe. I needed to find the weakness that I knew must be there, the pathway that would lead me up its body to the sigil that pulsed somewhere beneath its fur. And as I watched the creature turn for another charge, I noticed something. The bottoms of its hooves glowed with the same pale light as its eyes, a light that seemed to concentrate and intensify just before each charge, as though drawing power from some source deep within the Colossus's body. And I remembered what Dorman had told me, that the sigils marked the locations where its power had been sealed, that the sword I carried was crafted specifically to pierce those seals and release what had been bound within. When the Colossus charged again, I did not dive to the side. Instead, I waited until the last possible moment, until I could see the individual strands of fur on its lowered head, until I could feel the heat of its breath washing over me like a wave of ancient air. And then I rolled, not away from the creature, but beneath it, between its pounding hooves, into the narrow space under its belly, where its massive body blocked out the sky and cast me into shadow. I found the sigil on its underbelly, glowing with that familiar otherworldly light, and I drove my sword upward with all the strength I possessed. The Colossus bellowed and reared, its front legs lifting off the ground as it tried to shake me loose. I clung to the fur of its belly, my sword still embedded in the sigil, my arms burning with the effort of holding on as the creature thrashed and bucked above me. I pulled the blade free and drove it in again, and again, and again, each strike releasing a spray of dark energy that seemed to absorb the light around it, each impact drawing another bellow of pain and confusion from the great beast that could not understand why this tiny creature was causing it such agony. When it fell hard. Its legs gave out beneath it, and it collapsed onto its side with an impact that sent shockwaves rippling through the plateau that knocked me tumbling across the grass like a leaf caught in a violent wind. I lay there for a long moment, staring up at the sky, my body aching, my lungs burning, my mind filled with a strange mixture of triumph and sorrow that I could not quite separate into its component parts. I had done it. I had felled the second Colossus. Only 14 remained. But as I pushed myself to my feet and walked toward where my horse waited at the edge of the plateau, I noticed something that I had not noticed before. There were dark tendrils emerging from the body of the fallen Colossus, wisps of shadow that seemed to have substance and intention, that drifted through the air toward me with a purpose I could not comprehend. Before I could react, before I could even think to run or defend myself, the tendrils reached me, passed through me, filled me with a coldness so profound that it seemed to freeze the very blood in my veins. And then there was darkness. I woke in the temple, lying on the stone floor beside the altar where my beloved still lay in her endless sleep. I did not remember returning here. I did not remember the journey back across the empty land, did not remember dismounting from my horse, did not remember walking through the great doors and collapsing in this sacred space. But here I was, and she was still beside me, still wrapped in her white cloth, still waiting for the miracle that I was slowly, painfully bringing into being. Dorman's voice filled the temple once more, congratulating me on my success, reminding me that 14 Colossi still remained, urging me to rest and recover my strength before setting out once more. And as I lay there on the cold stone, staring up at the ceiling that stretched into shadow far above my head, I became aware of something else, something that had not been there before. There were figures standing in the corners of the temple, shapes that were almost human, but not quite, silhouettes that seemed to be made of the same dark energy that had emerged from the fallen Colossi and passed through my body. They did not move, they did not speak, they simply stood there, watching me with eyes I could not see, waiting for something I could not understand. I pushed myself to my feet and walked to the temple entrance, looking out across the land that I had already begun to change through my actions. My horse stood in the courtyard, patient as always, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her presence, for her unwavering loyalty in a world that had become increasingly strange and uncertain. I did not know what the dark figures in the temple meant. I did not know what was happening to my body, to my soul, to the fundamental nature of my existence. But I knew that I could not stop. I knew that I had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. I knew that somewhere out there, 14 more colossi waited to be felled, and that each one brought me closer to the moment when my beloved would open her eyes and smile at me once more. I mounted my horse and rode out into the pale light of another day in this timeless land. The third Colossus dwelt in the midst of a great lake, its body rising from the water like an island unto itself. I stood on the shore and watched it for a long time before I understood what I was seeing, for at first it appeared to be nothing more than a formation of rock and earth, a natural feature of the landscape no different from the countless others I had passed on my journey. But then it moved, and I realized that what I had taken for stone was actually armor, plates of ancient metal that had rusted and weathered until they resembled the cliffs and outcroppings of the surrounding terrain. Its body was long and serpentine, curving through the water with a grace that belied its enormous size, its head rising on a neck that seemed to stretch forever upward toward the sky. There was no way to reach it from the shore. The water was too deep, the distance too great, and I was no swimmer even under the best of circumstances. I circled the lake, searching for another approach, and eventually I found what I was looking for, a series of stone platforms that jutted out from the shore at irregular intervals, leading toward a crumbling structure that rose from the center of the lake near where the Colossus drifted in its endless, dreaming patrol. I leaped from platform to platform, my heart pounding with each jump, my eyes fixed on the stone ahead rather than the dark water below. Some of the platforms were stable, solid enough to support my weight without shifting. Others crumbled beneath my feet the moment I landed, forcing me to leap again immediately, to trust my momentum and my instincts to carry me to the next solid surface before the lake swallowed me whole. It was exhausting, terrifying, exhilarating, in a way that made me feel more alive than I had felt since before she died, since before my world collapsed into the gray monotony of grief and longing. I reached the central structure and climbed to its highest point, a narrow platform that swayed slightly in the wind that blew across the lake. From here, I could see the Colossus more clearly, could observe the patterns of its movement, the rhythm of its patrol through the dark waters, and I could see the sigil glowing faintly on the top of its head, so far above the water that reaching it seemed almost impossible. But nothing was impossible anymore. Nothing was beyond my reach, beyond my will, beyond the desperate determination that had carried me across the bridge and into this land of giants and silence. I waited until the Colossus passed close to the structure, and then I jumped. The impact nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. I landed on the Colossus's back, on one of the great plates of armor that covered its serpentine body, and I immediately began to slide, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth, wet metal. For a terrifying moment, I thought I would fall, thought the lake would claim me, and all of this would have been for nothing. But then my hand found a gap between two plates, a narrow crevice where rust had eaten away at the ancient metal, and I held on with a grip that refused to yield. The Colossus felt me. It began to move with purpose, diving beneath the surface of the lake, dragging me down into the cold, dark water that pressed against my body from all sides. I held my breath, held on, refused to let go, even as my lungs burned and my vision began to darken at the edges. And then we surfaced, and I gasped for air, and I began to climb, pulling myself up the creature's back, up its impossibly long neck, toward the head, where the sigil waited like a beacon calling me home. The climb took forever. The Colossus twisted and dove, trying to shake me loose, trying to drown me in the depths of its lake. But I held on. I always held on. And eventually, after what felt like hours of struggle and suffering, I reached the top of its head and raised my sword and drove it down into the glowing sigil with a cry that echoed across the water and was swallowed by the silence of the surrounding land. The Colossus sank slowly, peacefully, its great body settling into the depths of the lake like a ship returning to the sea that had given it birth. I rode its head down until the water began to lap at my feet, and then I dove, swimming with desperate strokes, toward the shore that seemed impossibly far away. My muscles screamed, my lungs begged for air, my mind narrowed to a single point of focus, a single imperative: reach the shore, reach the shore, reach the shore. I dragged myself onto the rocks and lay there, coughing up water, trembling with exhaustion and cold. Above me, the sky stretched pale and endless, unmarked by cloud or bird or any sign of life. Behind me, the lake had grown still once more, its surface unbroken, giving no indication that a creature the size of a small mountain had just sunk beneath its waves. And ahead of me, somewhere in the vast emptiness of this land, 11 more Colossi waited. My horse found me there, on the shore. I do not know how she knew where I was, how she navigated the treacherous terrain to reach me, but there she was, nuzzling my face with her soft nose, her warm breath washing over me like a blessing from a world I had almost forgotten. I wrapped my arms around her neck and wept, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my chest, somewhere in the core of my being where all the grief and exhaustion and desperate hope had been building since the moment I first set foot upon the bridge. When the tears finally stopped, I mounted her back and rode toward the temple. The dark tendrils found me again as I traveled, emerging from nowhere, passing through my body with that same freezing coldness that seemed to steal something vital from my very soul. And once again, I woke in the temple, lying on the stone floor beside my beloved, with no memory of how I had arrived. The figures in the corners had multiplied. Where before there had been 2 or 3, now there were 5 or 6, standing in perfect stillness, watching me with their invisible eyes. I tried to approach one of them, tried to see what they were, what they wanted, but as I drew near, it seemed to recede, maintaining the distance between us no matter how quickly I walked. Eventually, I gave up and turned my attention back to the task at hand. Dorman's voice congratulated me once more. 11 Colossi remained. My beloved grew closer to waking with each one that fell. I should rest, recover my strength, and set out again when I was ready. I did not rest. I could not rest. Every moment I spent in the temple was a moment she spent in darkness, in that place between life and death, where I could not reach her, could not comfort her, could not tell her that I was coming, that I would not give up, that I would tear down every Colossus in this world, and the next, if that was what it took to bring her back. I mounted my horse and rode out once more. The 4th Colossus was smaller than the others, though still massive by any human standard. It lived in a series of underground caverns that wound beneath the hills to the east, tunnels carved by water or by hands so ancient that their tools and techniques had been forgotten by the world above. I followed the light of my sword into the darkness, my horse unable to accompany me through the narrow passages, her worried whinnies echoing behind me as I descended into the earth. The caverns were not entirely dark. There was a phosphorescence to the walls, a faint glow produced by some combination of minerals and moisture that painted everything in shades of pale blue and green. It was beautiful in its way, beautiful and eerie and profoundly lonely, like walking through the veins of a sleeping giant or the dreams of a creature too vast to imagine. I moved through the tunnels slowly, carefully, my sword held before me like a lantern, its blade pointing the way toward the Colossus that waited somewhere in the depths below. I found it in a vast underground chamber, a space so large that its ceiling vanished into shadow high above my head. The Colossus stood in the center of the chamber, its body hunched and compact, its legs shorter and thicker than those of the creatures I had faced before. It had no fur, only stone, plates of rock that had fused with its body over countless centuries until it was difficult to tell where the creature ended and the cavern began. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, 2 points of blue light that tracked my movement as I emerged from the tunnel and stepped into the open space of the chamber. It was faster than I expected. Despite its bulk, Despite its apparent heaviness, it moved with a quickness that caught me off guard, scuttling toward me on its thick legs like some enormous spider or crab, its stone body grinding against the floor of the cavern with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I ran, not away from it, but around it, circling the chamber, searching for the handholds that would allow me to climb, searching for the sigil that marked the location of the sealed power. I found it on the creature's back, a glowing mark nestled between two of the great stone plates that covered its body. But reaching it was another matter entirely. Every time I tried to approach, the Colossus would spin toward me, its speed making it impossible to get close enough to grab hold of its rocky hide. I needed to slow it down somehow, needed to create an opening that would give me the time to climb. The tunnels. There were several openings around the edges of the chamber, passages that led deeper into the earth or back toward the surface. They were narrow, far too narrow for the Colossus to follow, but perhaps large enough to serve as shelter, as a place from which I could observe and plan and wait for my moment. I dove into one of the tunnels just as the Colossus reached me, its stone body slamming into the wall above my head with a force that shook the entire cavern. It could not follow. It clawed at the entrance, its thick legs scraping against the rock, its eyes peering into the darkness where I crouched, breathing hard, my mind racing through possibilities and strategies. I emerged from the tunnel on the other side of the chamber, behind the Colossus, while it was still focused on the entrance where I had disappeared. I ran toward it, leaped onto its back, grabbed hold of the edge of one of its stone plates, and began to pull myself up. The Colossus roared and spun, trying to dislodge me, but I had already found my grip, had already begun the climb toward the sigil that pulsed with light just a few feet above my head. The sword found its mark. The Colossus screamed. The light faded from its eyes, and it collapsed onto the floor of the cavern with an impact that sent cracks spider-webbing through the stone in every direction. I rode its body down, my sword still embedded in the sigil, my arms wrapped around one of the stone plates that had protected it for so long and had failed it in the end. The dark tendrils came, as they always came, and when I woke in the temple, there were more figures standing in the shadows, more silent watchers gathered to observe my slow transformation into something I did not yet understand. 10 colossi remained. I did not pause to count the figures. I did not stop to examine my own reflection in the pools of water that had gathered in the low places of the temple floor. I simply rose, walked to my horse, and rode out into the pale light of a world that grew stranger and more dreamlike with each passing day. The 5th Colossus was a creature of the air, a vast bird-like being that soared above the ruins of an ancient city, its wings casting shadows that swept across the crumbling buildings like the hands of a god reaching down to touch the earth. I stood in the center of what had once been a great plaza, watching it circle overhead, its body silhouetted against the sky, its cry echoing off the walls of structures that had not heard a human voice in centuries. There was no way to reach it while it flew. I would have to find a way to bring it down, to force it to land, or at least to come close enough to the ground that I could leap onto its back. I searched the ruins for anything that might help, any mechanism or structure that might provide the elevation I needed, and eventually I found it, a series of platforms that rose from the center of the plaza like a staircase to the heavens, their surfaces worn smooth by time, but still sturdy enough to support my weight. I climbed to the highest platform and waited. The Colossus continued to circle, its great wings beating the air with a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. It had seen me, I was certain of that. It knew I was there, knew what I intended to do, but it did not attack, did not swoop down to destroy the tiny creature that threatened its existence. It simply watched and waited, as though giving me the chance to change my mind, to turn back, to abandon this violent path I had chosen. I did not turn back. I raised my sword and shouted, a wordless cry of challenge that echoed across the empty plaza and rose toward the sky where the Colossus flew. And the Colossus answered. It folded its wings and dove, plummeting toward me like a falling star, its great beak open, its eyes burning with a light that was brighter and fiercer than any I had seen before. I leaped at the last possible moment, my arms outstretched, my fingers reaching for the fur that covered the Colossus's chest. I caught hold, barely, my grip slipping on the coarse hair as the creature pulled up from its dive and began to climb once more. The wind tore at my clothes, threatened to rip me from my precarious perch and send me tumbling to the earth far below. But I held on. I always held on. The climb was unlike anything I had experienced before. There was no solid ground beneath me, no stable surface to brace against. There was only the wind and the creature and the endless blue sky that stretched in every direction, unmarked by cloud or landmark, giving no indication of up or down, of near or far, of anything at all except the terrible, exhilarating sensation of flight. I found the sigil on the creature's back, between its enormous wings. I drove my sword into it, while the world spun around me, while the Colossus screamed and dove and climbed and rolled, trying to shake me loose, trying to escape the pain that bloomed in its ancient body like a flower of darkness and light. And when it finally fell, I fell with it, tumbling through the air, watching the ground rush up to meet me with a speed that should have meant the end of everything. But something caught me. Something slowed my fall, cushioned my landing, set me down on the grass of the plaza with a gentleness that I did not deserve and could not explain. The dark tendrils, perhaps, the power that was slowly filling me as each Colossus fell, or something else entirely, some force that wanted me to complete my task, that needed me to reach the end of this journey for reasons I could not begin to comprehend. 9 Colossi remained, and in the temple 9 more figures had joined the silent watchers, their numbers growing with each conquest, their presence a constant reminder that I was changing, that something was being taken from me even as something else was being given. But I did not stop. I could not stop, for she was waiting, my beloved, my reason, my everything, and I would tear down every Colossus in this land, would sacrifice every piece of myself that remained, would walk into darkness and never return, if that was what it took to see her smile one more time. The days began to blur together after that, if they could even be called days in a land where the sun moved according to its own inscrutable logic, and the passage of time was marked not by hours or minutes, but by the falling of giants and the slow accumulation of shadows in the corners of my vision. I rode, and I climbed, and I drove my sword into sigil after sigil, and with each conquest I felt myself becoming less of what I had been and more of something I could not name, something that existed in the space between human and other, between the living and the vast, dreaming silence that permeated every stone and blade of grass in this forgotten realm. The 6th Colossus dwelt in ruins that might once have been a temple or a palace, or perhaps something else entirely, a structure whose purpose had been lost, along with the civilization that built it. Great columns rose from the earth at irregular intervals, some still standing proud against the sky, others fallen and broken, their fragments scattered across the ground like the bones of creatures too massive to have ever truly existed. Grass grew between the stones, and moss covered the carvings that decorated the surfaces of the columns, obscuring images of figures and events that had once held meaning for someone, somewhere, in some age that had ended so long ago that even the memory of its ending had faded into nothing. The Colossus moved among the columns like a ghost, its body low and elongated, its many legs carrying it with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with its enormous size. It was covered in a beard of thick fur that hung from its chin and chest, dragging along the ground as it walked, collecting dust and debris and fragments of the ruins it called home. Its eyes glowed with that familiar blue light, but there was something different in them, something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps recognition, as though it had been expecting me, as though it had known for a long time that I would come. I followed it through the ruins, keeping my distance, watching its patterns of movement, learning the rhythm of its patrol through the broken columns and crumbling walls. It was not aggressive, like the second Colossus had been, did not charge at me or try to crush me beneath its many feet. It simply walked, slowly and deliberately, as though lost in contemplation of some ancient memory, or perhaps mourning the loss of the world that had once surrounded it with life and purpose and meaning. Finding a way onto its body proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Its legs were too thick and smooth to climb, and its belly hung too high above the ground for me to reach from below. I needed elevation, needed to find a vantage point from which I could leap onto its back as it passed. And so I climbed one of the fallen columns, pulling myself up to its highest point, and I waited there as the Colossus made its slow circuit through the ruins, its path bringing it closer and closer to where I crouched in readiness. When it passed beneath me, I jumped. My hands found purchase in the thick fur of its beard, and I began to climb, pulling myself up through the coarse hair that seemed to go on forever. An endless forest of strands that tangled around my arms and legs. I made every movement a struggle against the weight of accumulated centuries. The Colossus felt me there, felt my presence in its beard, and it began to shake its head, slowly at first, then with increasing violence, trying to dislodge the intruder that had invaded its personal space. I held on. I always held on. And eventually, after what felt like hours of climbing through that strange forest of fur, I emerged onto the top of the creature's head, where the sigil pulsed with light against the stone of its skull. I raised my sword, and I struck, and the Colossus screamed with a voice that shook the remaining columns and brought several of them crashing to the ground in clouds of dust and fragments of ancient stone. It fell among the ruins it had guarded for so long, its body coming to rest against one of the great columns, its eyes fading from blue to black, its legs folding beneath it with a final, gentle sigh that might have been relief, or might have been sorrow, or might have been nothing at all, simply the last exhalation of a creature that had existed beyond the span of human comprehension, and had finally been granted the rest it had never known it wanted. 8 Colossi remained. The 7th was a creature of the water, different from the serpentine being I had faced in the lake. This one dwelt in the shallows of a great inland sea, its body covered in thick plates of what looked like coral, or perhaps some form of organic armor that had grown over its skin during the long centuries of its existence. Spines rose from its back like the masts of sunken ships, and electricity crackled between them, arcs of blue-white energy that illuminated the murky water and sent schools of strange, pale fish scattering in every direction. I could not approach it directly. The electricity that danced across its body would kill me long before I could reach the sigil that glowed somewhere beneath the water's surface. I needed to find another way, needed to disable the creature's defenses before I could begin my climb. The answer came to me as I watched from the shore, observing the patterns of the electrical discharge, noting the way the energy seemed to concentrate in the spines before releasing in great arcs that leaped from point to point across the creature's back. The spines were the key. If I could destroy them, or at least damage them enough to disrupt the flow of electricity, I might be able to approach safely. I waded into the shallows, the water cold against my skin, the mud of the seafloor sucking at my feet with each step. The Colossus noticed me immediately, turning its great body toward me, the electricity on its back intensifying as it prepared to defend itself against this tiny intruder. I dove beneath the surface just as the first arc of energy crackled through the air where I had been standing, and I swam toward the creature's tail, toward the one part of its body that seemed free of the deadly spines. My sword found the flesh beneath the armored plates, and the Colossus roared, a sound that was strangely muffled by the water, that reached my ears as a deep, thrumming vibration rather than the sharp cry I had come to expect. It thrashed, trying to reach me with its tail, trying to bring its electrified spines close enough to end my assault. But I was already moving, already climbing, already making my way up its body toward the first of the great spines that rose from its back. I struck the base of the spine with my sword, and it shattered, the electricity that had been flowing through it dissipating into the water in a shower of sparks that made my skin tingle but did not burn. One by one, I destroyed the spines, working my way up the creature's back, each strike bringing me closer to the sigil, each shattered spine reducing the deadly energy that crackled around me. And when the last spine fell, when the electricity finally died, and the creature's defenses were neutralized, I found the sigil glowing on the back of its head, and drove my sword home with a cry that echoed across the surface of the inland sea. The Colossus sank into the shallows, its body settling into the mud, its eyes dimming, its ancient life coming to an end in the same waters where it had dwelt for longer than human memory could comprehend. I swam to shore and collapsed on the rocks, my body exhausted, my mind numb, my heart filled with that strange mixture of triumph and sorrow that had become my constant companion since this journey began. 7 colossi remained. The 8th was perhaps the strangest of all those I had faced so far. It lived in the walls of a great canyon, a vertical labyrinth of ledges and caves and narrow passages that wound through the rock like the burrows of some enormous worm. The Colossus itself was small compared to the others, no larger than a house, but it was quick and venomous, its body covered in glowing patches that pulsed with a sickly green light, its legs ending in sharp points that allowed it to cling to the canyon walls with perfect ease. I descended into the canyon slowly, carefully, testing each handhold before committing my weight, aware that a single misstep would send me tumbling into the darkness below. The Colossus watched me from above, its many eyes tracking my movement, its body shifting position to keep me in sight as I made my way deeper into its domain. It did not attack, not yet. It seemed to be waiting for something, some signal or trigger that would unleash its aggression. I found the trigger when I stepped onto a ledge that was not a ledge at all, but a part of the Colossus's body, camouflaged to blend perfectly with the surrounding rock. The creature moved with terrifying speed, scuttling up the canyon wall toward me, its sharp legs clicking against the stone, its glowing patches pulsing brighter and brighter as it closed the distance between us. I ran, leaping from ledge to ledge, scrambling up the canyon wall with a desperation born of pure survival instinct. But running was not enough. The Colossus was faster than me, more agile, more at home in this vertical world than I could ever hope to be. I needed to fight, needed to turn and face this creature and find a way to bring it down before it brought me down instead. I found a stable ledge and drew my sword, holding it before me as the Colossus approached. Its eyes, all dozen of them, fixed on the blade, and something changed in its demeanor. It slowed, became more cautious, began to circle me rather than charging directly. The sword, I realized. The ancient sword that Dorman had told me was crafted specifically to pierce the seals that bound its power. The Colossi feared it. They recognized it as the instrument of their destruction, and even their primitive instincts recoiled from its presence. I used that fear. I advanced toward the Colossus, sword extended, driving it back along the canyon wall, herding it toward a dead end where it would have nowhere left to run. And when it finally turned to face me, when it reared up on its hind legs and prepared to strike, I was ready. I dove beneath its attack, rolled across the narrow ledge, and came up behind it, my sword already descending toward the sigil that glowed on the back of its neck. The strike was true. The Colossus screamed and fell, tumbling down the canyon wall, bouncing off ledges and outcroppings until it finally came to rest in the darkness at the bottom, its glowing patches fading one by one until the canyon was plunged into a blackness so complete that I could not see my own hand in front of my face. I climbed out of the canyon by touch alone, my fingers finding handholds in the rock, my body remembering the path I had taken on the way down. And when I finally emerged into the pale light of the world above, I fell to my knees and simply breathed, simply existed, simply allowed myself a moment of rest before the journey continued. 6 colossi remained. The 9th Colossus was a thing of nightmares, a creature that seemed to have been designed by a mind that understood fear on a level far deeper than any human could comprehend. It lived in a great cavern beneath a geyser field, a place where steam rose from cracks in the earth and pools of boiling water bubbled and hissed with a sound like the breathing of some vast, slumbering beast. The Colossus itself was shaped like a tortoise, its body covered in a shell of stone so thick that no sword could penetrate it, its legs like pillars, its head hidden beneath a ridge of rock that protected it from attack. I circled the creature for what felt like hours, searching for a weakness, searching for the sigil that I knew must be hidden somewhere on its body. But there was nothing, no gap in its armor, no exposed flesh, no point of vulnerability that I could exploit. The Colossus simply walked, slowly and deliberately, through its domain of steam and boiling water, seemingly unaware of my presence, seemingly unconcerned by the tiny figure that followed in its wake. The geysers. I noticed them as I walked, noticed the way they erupted at regular intervals, noticed the way the Colossus seemed to time its movements to avoid the scalding blasts of steam that shot from the earth. And I noticed something else, something that gave me hope. When the geysers erupted near the Colossus, the creature would rear back, would lift its front legs off the ground to avoid the heat, would expose the underside of its body for just a moment before settling back down. I waited near one of the geysers, timing its eruptions, counting the seconds between each blast of steam. And when the Colossus approached, when it walked directly over the vent in the earth, I was ready. The geyser erupted, and the Colossus reared, and I ran, sliding beneath its raised body, my sword already drawn, my eyes fixed on the sigil that glowed on the underside of its shell. I struck once, twice, 3 times before the Colossus came back down, its weight crashing into the earth around me, its legs scrambling for purchase on the slippery rock. I rolled free, barely, my clothes singed by the steam, my skin red and raw from the heat. But I had wounded it. I had found its weakness, and now I simply had to do it again, and again, until the creature fell. It took time, it took patience, it took a willingness to endure pain and exhaustion that I had not known I possessed. But eventually, after what might have been hours or might have been days, the Colossus collapsed. Its legs gave out, its head drooped, its eyes faded from blue to black, and I stood beside its fallen body, my sword dripping with the dark energy that had poured from its wounds, my heart filled with a weariness so profound that it seemed to reach beyond my body and into the very core of my soul. 5 colossi remained, and I was running out of pieces of myself to sacrifice. The temple was darker when I returned this time, the pale light that filtered through its windows seeming somehow dimmer, somehow less substantial than it had been before. The figures in the corners had multiplied again, their numbers now too great to count, their silent presence filling the sacred space with an atmosphere of anticipation that made my skin crawl. And when I looked at my beloved, lying there on the altar in her white cloth, I noticed something that I had not noticed before. She was changing. It was subtle, so subtle that I might have missed it if I had not been looking for it, if I had not spent so many hours memorizing every detail of her face in the days since she died. But there was color returning to her cheeks, a faint flush of pink beneath the pale, death-like whiteness that had defined her appearance since the moment her heart stopped beating. Her lips, which had been blue and cold, now held a hint of their former warmth. And when I placed my hand on her chest, I felt something that made my heart leap with a joy so fierce and desperate that it brought tears to my eyes. A heartbeat, faint, irregular, barely there at all, but present, real, proof that what I was doing was working, that each Colossus I felled brought her closer to the world of the living, that the price I was paying was being transformed into the miracle I had crossed this land to find. Dorman's voice filled the temple, confirming what I had discovered, congratulating me on my progress, urging me to continue. 5 Colossi remained, 5 more seals to break, 5 more fragments of power to release, 5 more ancient lives to end in the name of love and loss and the desperate refusal to accept what could not be changed. I did not rest. I could not rest. Not now. Not when I was so close. Not when I could feel her heart beating beneath my palm, weak and uncertain, but undeniably alive. I mounted my horse and rode out into the pale light of yet another day, my eyes fixed on the horizon, my mind focused on the task ahead, my soul filled with a determination that burned brighter than the sun that hung eternally above this land of giants and silence and dreams. The 10th Colossus awaited me in a desert of endless sand, a creature so large that it had carved great trenches in the dunes simply by moving through them over the course of centuries. It was worm-like in shape, its body segmented, its mouth ringed with teeth that could crush stone as easily as I could crush a grape between my fingers. It moved beneath the sand, emerging only to swallow the air before diving back into the depths, its passage marked by a ridge of disturbed earth that traveled across the desert like a wave rolling toward shore. I could not fight it on foot. The sand was too soft, too unstable, and the creature was too fast, too unpredictable in its movements. I needed my horse, needed her speed and her agility to keep me ahead of the Colossus while I searched for a way to bring it down. We raced across the desert, my horse and I, her hooves kicking up clouds of sand as she ran, her breath coming in great heaving gasps that matched the pounding of my own heart. The Colossus pursued us, its mouth open, its teeth gleaming in the pale light, its body rising from the sand like something out of a nightmare. I could feel the heat of its breath on my back, could hear the grinding of its teeth as it snapped at the air just inches behind my horse's tail. But I was not trying to escape. I was leading it, guiding it toward the rocky outcroppings that rose from the desert in the distance, the only solid ground in this sea of shifting sand. If I could reach those rocks, if I could find stable footing, I might have a chance. We reached the rocks just ahead of the Colossus, my horse leaping from the sand onto the stone with a grace that took my breath away. I dismounted and turned to face the creature, my sword drawn, my stance ready. The Colossus emerged from the sand, its great mouth opening wide, preparing to swallow me whole along with the rock on which I stood. I saw my opportunity. The inside of its mouth was soft, vulnerable, unprotected by the armored segments that covered the rest of its body. And deep in its throat, I could see a glow, faint but unmistakable, the sigil that marked the location of the sealed power. I ran toward the creature instead of away from it. I leaped from the rock, sailed through the air, and landed inside its open mouth, my feet slipping on the wet flesh of its tongue, my hands scrambling for purchase on the ridges of its palate. The mouth began to close around me, the teeth descending like the bars of a cage. But I was already moving, already sliding down its throat, already making my way toward the glow that pulsed in the darkness ahead. The sigil was there, embedded in the flesh of its throat, surrounded by rings of muscle that contracted and relaxed with the creature's breathing. I drove my sword into it with all the strength I possessed, and the Colossus screamed, a sound that echoed through its body and filled me with a vibration so intense that I thought my bones might shatter from the force of it. The creature convulsed, its body thrashing, its mouth opening wide in a howl of pain and confusion. I was thrown upward, expelled from its throat, like something unpleasant it had accidentally swallowed. and I landed in the sand some distance away, my body aching, my clothes soaked with the creature's saliva, my mind struggling to process what I had just done. The Colossus sank into the sand, its body going still, its eyes dimming, its ancient life coming to an end in the desert that had been its home for longer than I could comprehend. And I lay there in the sand, staring up at the pale sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, knowing that I should get up, should continue, should find my horse and ride toward the next Colossus. But for a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to rest. I allowed myself to close my eyes and breathe and remember what it had felt like to be alive, truly alive, before grief had hollowed me out and filled me with nothing but the desperate need to undo what had been done. 4 Colossi remained, and somewhere in the temple my beloved's heart continued to beat, stronger now, steadier, calling me back to the task that would soon be complete. 4 Colossi remained, and I could feel the end approaching, like the first faint light of dawn on the horizon after a long and terrible night. My body had become a map of the battles I had fought, scarred and bruised and worn in ways that would never fully heal. But my spirit burned brighter than ever, fueled by the knowledge that each step brought me closer to the moment when my beloved would open her eyes, when her lips would part and speak my name, when the impossible would become possible, and all of this suffering would finally have meaning. I found my horse waiting for me at the edge of the desert, her coat dusty, but her eyes as warm and patient as ever. She had followed me, as she always followed me, through landscapes that should have been impassable, across distances that should have taken days to traverse. I did not understand how she did it, did not understand the bond that connected us, or the loyalty that drove her to remain by my side through all of this madness. But I was grateful for her presence, grateful beyond words, and I pressed my forehead against her neck and whispered my thanks into her mane before mounting her back and riding toward the light of my sword. The 11th Colossus dwelt in a place of fire and shadow, a volcanic region in the far north, where the earth itself seemed to be at war with the sky. Great plumes of smoke rose from fissures in the ground, and rivers of molten rock wound through valleys of black stone, their orange glow providing the only light in a landscape otherwise dominated by ash and darkness. The air was thick and hot, difficult to breathe, and my horse grew nervous as we approached, her hooves dancing on the unstable ground, her nostrils flaring at the sulphurous smell that permeated everything. I dismounted and continued on foot, leaving her at the edge of the volcanic field, where the ground was still solid and the air was still breathable. She whinnied after me, a sound of concern and protest, but I could not bring her into this place. It was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and I would not risk her life on top of everything else I had already risked and lost. The Colossus emerged from the smoke like a demon rising from the depths of some ancient hell. It was smaller than many of the others, but what it lacked in size it made up for in ferocity. Its body was covered in plates of stone that glowed with internal heat, and fire leaked from the gaps between them, tongues of flame that licked at the air and left trails of embers in its wake. Its eyes burned with a fury that I had not seen in any of the others, a rage that seemed directed not just at me, but at everything, at the world itself, at the existence that had trapped it in this burning wasteland for countless centuries. It charged the moment it saw me, its body low to the ground, its legs churning through the ash and rock with a speed that defied its bulk. I ran, not because I was afraid, but because I needed time, needed space to observe and plan and find the weakness that I knew must be there somewhere. The creature pursued me through the volcanic field, leaping over rivers of lava, crashing through columns of solidified stone, its roar echoing off the walls of the valley like the voice of the mountain itself given form and fury. I noticed the pattern as I ran. The Colossus was fast, but it was not tireless. After each burst of speed, it would slow, would pause to catch its breath, would stand still for just a moment, while the fire that burned within its body rebuilt its strength. And during those pauses, the flames that covered its body would dim, would retreat into the gaps between its armor, would leave patches of its hide exposed and vulnerable. I waited for the next pause, timing my movements, positioning myself near a formation of rock that would provide both cover and elevation. When the Colossus slowed, when its flames dimmed and its body grew still, I ran toward it rather than away. I leaped onto its back, my hands finding purchase on the cooling stone of its armor, and I began to climb toward the sigil that I could see glowing on the top of its head. The Colossus roared, and the flames returned, bursting from the gaps in its armor with a heat so intense that I could feel my skin beginning to blister. I climbed faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring the smell of my own burning flesh, focusing only on the sigil, only on the goal, only on the beloved face that waited for me in the temple at the heart of this land. My sword found its mark just as the flames reached their peak, and the Colossus screamed, a sound of agony and release that seemed to shake the very foundations of the volcanic field. It collapsed into one of the rivers of lava, its body sinking into the molten rock, its flames merging with the greater fire that surrounded it, until there was nothing left but a dark shape beneath the glowing surface, a shadow of what had once been a creature of unimaginable power. I had jumped clear at the last moment, had landed on a narrow ledge of solid stone, had watched the Colossus disappear into the earth from which it had been born so many ages ago. 3 colossi remained. I made my way back to my horse through a landscape that seemed somehow quieter, somehow less hostile, as though the death of the Colossus had calmed the volcanic fury that had defined this place for so long. She was waiting where I had left her, her eyes bright with relief when she saw me approaching, her body pressing against mine as I reached her side. I mounted her back and we rode south, away from the fire and smoke, toward the cool forests and quiet meadows that lay between us and our next destination. The 12th Colossus was a thing of water and mist, a creature that haunted a great lake in the heart of the land, emerging only during the brief periods of rain that swept across this realm at irregular intervals. I arrived at the lake during a time of stillness, when the surface was smooth as glass, and the surrounding trees stood reflected in the water with perfect clarity. There was no sign of the Colossus, no indication that anything lived in the depths below, but my sword pointed toward the center of the lake, and I trusted its guidance as I had trusted it from the beginning. I waited on the shore for what might have been hours, watching the sky, watching the water, watching for any sign of the creature that I had come to destroy. And eventually, as the light began to fade and the first clouds appeared on the horizon, I saw it. A ripple on the surface, a disturbance in the perfect reflection, a shape rising from the depths with a slowness that spoke of ancient patience and timeless existence. The Colossus was beautiful in a way that none of the others had been. Its body was covered in flowing tendrils that might have been hair or might have been some form of aquatic vegetation, strands of green and blue that drifted in the water around it like the robes of some underwater deity. Its face was almost human, with features that suggested intelligence and emotion, with eyes that seemed to hold a sadness so profound that I felt my own heart ache in response. It rose from the lake until its head and shoulders were above the surface, and it looked at me, looked directly at me, and I swear that in that moment it knew exactly what I was, exactly why I had come, exactly what I intended to do. It did not attack. It did not try to defend itself. It simply floated there, watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. And for the first time since I had begun this journey, I hesitated. I looked at this creature, this ancient and beautiful being, and I wondered if what I was doing was right, if the love that drove me justified the destruction I was leaving in my wake. If my beloved would even want to return to a world that had been purchased with so much innocent blood. But then I remembered her face. I remembered her smile, her laugh, the way she would rest her head on my shoulder when she was tired, the way she would whisper my name in the darkness before sleep claimed us both. I remembered the emptiness I had felt when she died, the hollow ache that had consumed every moment of every day since her heart stopped beating. And I knew that I could not stop. I could not turn back. I had come too far and sacrificed too much to abandon the path now, regardless of the cost, regardless of the consequences, regardless of anything except the desperate need to hold her in my arms once more. I waded into the lake. The water was cold, colder than I had expected, and it seemed to resist my movements, to push back against me as though trying to protect the creature that floated at its center. But I pressed forward, swimming when the water became too deep to walk, my eyes fixed on the Colossus, my sword held above the surface, its blade pointed toward the sigil that I could see glowing on the creature's forehead. The Colossus did not flee as I approached. It did not dive beneath the surface or summon waves to push me back. It simply watched, its sad eyes following my progress, its beautiful face unchanging as I climbed onto its shoulder and began to make my way toward the sigil. And when I finally raised my sword, when I finally prepared to deliver the blow that would end its ancient existence, I could have sworn that I saw something in those eyes that looked almost like gratitude, almost like relief, as though it had been waiting for this moment for longer than I could comprehend, as though death was not an ending, but a release from a burden that had grown too heavy to bear. I struck. The Colossus sighed, a sound like wind passing through empty corridors, and slowly, gently, it sank back beneath the surface of the lake. I floated there, in the water, watching it descend, watching the ripples spread outward in concentric circles until they reached the shore and faded into stillness. And then there was nothing but the lake and the sky and the silence that had reclaimed this place as completely as if the Colossus had never existed at all. 2 colossi remained. I swam to shore and found my horse waiting at the water's edge, her head lowered to drink from the lake that had just become a grave. I mounted her back and we rode toward the temple, toward the place where my beloved lay in her endless sleep, toward the moment that was now so close I could almost taste it on the air. The dark tendrils found me as we traveled, passed through my body with their familiar cold, and I woke once again on the stone floor of the temple, surrounded by shadows that had grown so numerous they seemed to fill every corner of the sacred space. I did not count them this time. I did not look at them, did not acknowledge their presence, did not allow myself to wonder what they were or what they meant for my future. I simply rose and walked to the altar where my beloved lay, and I placed my hand on her chest, and I felt her heart beating strong and steady beneath my palm, a rhythm that matched my own, a pulse that spoke of life and warmth and the imminent return of everything I had lost. Her eyes were still closed, but there was movement beneath the lids, the flicker of dreams or perhaps the first stirrings of consciousness returning after its long absence. Her lips had regained their color, a soft pink that reminded me of the roses she used to grow in the garden behind our home, the garden where we had first kissed, the garden where I had asked her to marry me, and she had said yes with tears streaming down her cheeks and a smile that outshone the sun. She was so close to waking, so close to returning, so close to making all of this worthwhile. 2 colossi remained, only 2 more obstacles between me and the miracle I had crossed this land to find. I did not rest. I could not rest, not when I was this close, not when I could feel her presence calling to me from the boundary between life and death, urging me forward, giving me the strength to continue when my body wanted nothing more than to collapse and never rise again. I mounted my horse and rode out into the pale light of what might have been dawn or might have been dusk, the sky offering no clues, the land giving no indication of the passage of time. The 13th Colossus was the largest I had yet encountered, a creature so vast that it seemed less like a living being and more like a feature of the landscape itself, a mountain that had decided to stand up and walk. It moved across a great plain in the east, each step covering a distance that would have taken me minutes to travel on horseback, each footfall creating a tremor that I could feel in my bones even from miles away. Its body was covered in structures that might have been natural formations or might have been the remnants of buildings, towers and walls and bridges that had grown into its flesh over the course of centuries until the boundary between creature and architecture had become impossible to discern. I rode toward it across the plain, my horse's hooves pounding against the grass with a rhythm that seemed impossibly small and fragile compared to the thunderous steps of the Colossus ahead. As I drew closer, I could see details that had been invisible from a distance, could see the pathways that wound up its legs and across its body, could see the platforms and ledges that would allow me to climb to whatever height was necessary to reach the sigil that must be hidden somewhere on its form. The climb took longer than any of the others. I ascended the Colossus's leg as one might ascend a cliff face, finding handholds in the crevices of its stony hide, pulling myself upward inch by inch while the creature continued to walk, each step threatening to shake me loose and send me tumbling to the ground far below. I reached its knee and rested there for a moment, catching my breath, looking out across the plain that stretched in every direction, seeing the land as the Colossus must see it, vast and empty and somehow beautiful in its desolation. I continued upward, climbing the creature's thigh, crossing the broad expanse of its hip, ascending the curved ridge of its spine toward the structures that rose from its back like a city built for giants. The Colossus did not seem to notice me, or if it did, it gave no sign, simply continuing its endless walk across the plain, its eyes fixed on some distant point that I could not see, its mind occupied with thoughts that I could not imagine. I found the first sigil on one of the structures, a platform that might have been a watchtower in some long-forgotten age. I drove my sword into it and felt the familiar surge of dark energy pass through my body, felt the Colossus shudder and stumble but not fall, felt the creature's pace quicken as though it had finally become aware of the threat that climbed upon its back. But there was more than one sigil. Of course there was. A creature this vast could not be felled with a single blow. I would have to find them all, would have to strike each one, would have to weaken this mountain of flesh and stone piece by piece until it finally collapsed. The second sigil was on the creature's shoulder, hidden beneath a growth of moss and lichen that had accumulated over the centuries. The third was on the back of its head, nestled in a crevice that required me to hang upside down while I drove my sword into the glowing mark. The fourth was on its chest, and reaching it required me to climb down the creature's front, to hang from its chin while I searched for the handhold that would allow me to continue my descent. With each strike, the Colossus grew weaker, slower, its steps becoming unsteady, its body beginning to lean and sway like a tree caught in a strong wind. And when I finally found the fifth sigil, the last sigil, buried deep in the center of its chest, like a heart made of light and ancient power, I knew that this was the end, that one more blow would bring this titan to its knees and leave only a single Colossus standing between me and my beloved. I struck, and the Colossus fell. The impact was unlike anything I had experienced before. The creature did not simply collapse. It crumbled, came apart, disintegrated into 1,000 pieces that scattered across the plain like the remnants of a civilization destroyed by some unimaginable catastrophe. I fell with it, tumbling through the air, surrounded by fragments of stone and architecture and ancient flesh, certain that this time there would be no miraculous salvation, certain that this time the ground would claim me, and all of this would have been for nothing. But something caught me. Something slowed my descent, cushioned my landing, set me down on the grass with that same inexplicable gentleness that had saved me before. I lay there among the ruins of the Colossus, staring up at the sky, my body broken in ways I could not yet comprehend, my mind filled with a clarity that seemed almost divine in its intensity. One Colossus remained, just one. And then she would wake, and I would hold her in my arms, and all of this suffering would finally be over. I tried to rise, but my legs would not support me. I tried to call for my horse, but my voice emerged as nothing more than a whisper, a faint exhalation that was swallowed by the silence of the plain. I lay there in the grass, watching the clouds drift across the pale sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, knowing that I should move, should continue, should find a way to complete the task that was so nearly finished. And then she was there, my horse, standing over me, her soft nose nuzzling my face, her warm breath washing over me like a blessing from some benevolent god. I do not know how she found me. I do not know how she always found me, no matter where I fell, no matter how far I had traveled from the place where I had left her. But she was there, as she was always there, patient and loyal and impossibly faithful to a master who had done nothing to deserve such devotion. I grabbed her mane and pulled myself up, using her strength when my own had failed me. I draped myself across her back, unable to sit upright, unable to do anything except cling to her and trust her to carry me where I needed to go. And she did. She carried me across the plain, through the forests and valleys and ancient ruins, back to the temple at the heart of this land where my beloved waited, and the final Colossus stood between me and everything I had ever wanted. The temple was nearly dark when we arrived. The pale light that had once illuminated its interior now reduced to a faint glow that barely penetrated the shadows that filled every corner. The figures were everywhere, no longer confined to the edges of the space but spread throughout the temple, standing in rows like soldiers awaiting orders, their invisible eyes all turned toward the altar where my beloved lay. I slid from my horse's back and collapsed on the stone floor, my body refusing to obey my commands, my strength finally and completely exhausted. But I could see her from where I lay, could see her chest rising and falling with each breath, could see her lips parting as though preparing to speak, could see her eyes moving beneath their lids with increasing urgency. She was so close, so impossibly close. Dorman's voice filled the temple, softer now, gentler, almost tender in its tone. One Colossus remained, it said, just one. And then the seal would be broken, the power would be restored, and the miracle would be complete. I should rest, recover my strength, prepare myself for the final battle that awaited. I did not argue. I could not argue, could not speak, could barely breathe. I simply lay there on the cold stone floor, watching my beloved, waiting for my body to heal enough to allow me to finish what I had started. And as I lay there, I felt something that I had not felt in a long time, something that I had almost forgotten existed. Hope, real, genuine, unshakable hope. One Colossus remained, and tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever my body finally allowed me to rise, I would find it, I would climb it, I would drive my sword into its sigil and watch the light fade from its eyes. And then I would return to this temple, and I would watch my beloved open her eyes, and I would hear her speak my name, and I would know that every sacrifice, every wound, every piece of my soul that I had given to this quest had been worth it. One Colossus remained, and nothing in this world or any other would stop me from bringing it down. I do not know how long I lay there on the temple floor, suspended between consciousness and something deeper, something that might have been sleep or might have been a kind of death, a temporary surrender of the self to the darkness that had been growing inside me since the first Colossus fell. Time had lost all meaning in this land, had become nothing more than a word used to describe a concept that no longer applied to my existence. There was only the waiting, the slow gathering of strength, the gradual return of feeling to limbs that had been pushed far beyond their limits. When I finally opened my eyes, the temple was different. The shadows had deepened, had thickened, had become something almost tangible, a presence that pressed against my skin and filled my lungs with each breath. The figures that had once stood in rows now surrounded me in a tight circle, their forms closer than they had ever been before, their invisible eyes fixed on me with an intensity that I could feel, even though I could not see. And my beloved, lying there on the altar just a few feet away, had changed as well. Her eyes were open, not fully, not completely, but open enough that I could see the faint glimmer of light reflecting off their surface, could see the movement of her gaze as it drifted slowly, dreamily, across the ceiling of the temple. She was waking. She was returning. The miracle that I had sacrificed everything to achieve was finally, impossibly, coming to pass. I tried to call her name, tried to reach out to her, tried to let her know that I was there, that I had come for her, that everything was going to be all right. But my voice emerged as nothing more than a croak, a broken sound that barely carried across the short distance between us. And she did not seem to hear, did not turn her head toward me, did not give any indication that she was aware of my presence. She simply lay there, her eyes half open, her lips slightly parted, her breath coming in slow, shallow rhythms that spoke of a consciousness still struggling to emerge from the depths of whatever darkness had claimed her. Dorman's voice filled the temple, and there was something different in its tone, something that might have been eagerness or anticipation, or perhaps something darker, something that I did not want to examine too closely. The final Colossus awaited, it said, the last seal, the last fragment of power, the last obstacle between me and the completion of my quest. I should go now, while the strength had returned to my body, while the will still burned bright in my heart. I should end this, once and for all. I pushed myself to my feet, my muscles screaming in protest, my bones aching with a weariness that seemed to have settled into their very marrow. I looked at my beloved one last time, memorizing the sight of her eyes, even half closed as they were, drinking in the reality of her returning consciousness, like a man dying of thirst, finally reaching an oasis. And then I turned and walked out of the temple into the pale light of the world beyond, where my horse waited and the final Colossus stood ready to receive me. The 16th Colossus dwelt in a place that I had passed many times during my journey but had never truly seen, a vast structure in the far south that rose from the earth like a monument to some forgotten god. It was not a natural formation, not a mountain or a cliff, or any feature of the landscape that could have been created by the slow workings of wind and water and time. It was built, constructed by hands that must have belonged to beings far greater than any human, designed for a purpose that I could not begin to comprehend. As I approached, I realized that the structure was not merely a dwelling for the Colossus. It was part of the Colossus, an extension of its body, a shell that it had grown or built or somehow acquired over the course of its impossibly long existence. The walls were its skin, the towers were its limbs, the great dome at its center was its head, featureless and smooth, rising into the sky like a skull stripped of all identifying characteristics. There was no obvious entrance, no doorway or passage that would allow me to reach the interior of the structure. I circled its base, searching for a weakness, searching for a way in, and eventually I found it, a series of handholds carved into the stone, a path that led upward along the outer wall toward the heights where I knew the sigil must be waiting. I began to climb. The wall seemed to go on forever, stretching upward into a sky that grew darker and more turbulent the higher I ascended. Clouds gathered overhead, thick and black and heavy with the promise of rain. and the wind began to blow with an intensity that threatened to tear me from my precarious perch and send me tumbling to the earth far below. But I held on. I always held on. And inch by inch, handhold by handhold, I made my way up the body of the final Colossus. The creature became aware of me when I was perhaps halfway to my goal. I felt a tremor pass through the stone beneath my fingers, a vibration that seemed to originate from deep within the structure and radiate outward in waves of increasing intensity. And then the wall began to move, began to shift and reconfigure itself, handholds disappearing, new obstacles appearing, the entire surface of the Colossus transforming into a puzzle that I would have to solve while clinging to its face hundreds of feet above the ground. I adapted. I observed the patterns of the shifting stone, learned the rhythm of its transformations, found the moments of stillness between each reconfiguration when I could move safely from one handhold to the next. It was exhausting, terrifying, exhilarating in a way that made every nerve in my body sing with a strange, fierce joy. I was alive. Despite everything I had been through, despite all the pieces of myself that I had sacrificed along the way, I was still alive, still fighting, still climbing toward the goal that had defined my existence since the moment I crossed the bridge into this forgotten land. The rain began to fall when I reached the upper levels of the structure, great sheets of water that cascaded down the walls and made every surface slick and treacherous. I could barely see through the downpour, could barely keep my grip on the stones that seemed determined to shake me loose, could barely hear anything except the roar of the wind and the pounding of the rain against the ancient surface of the Colossus. But I continued to climb, continued to push upward, continued to reach for the heights that I knew held the answer to everything. The sigil was at the very top, on the smooth dome of the creature's head, glowing with a light that was visible even through the storm. I pulled myself up the final few feet, my arms burning, my lungs heaving, my heart pounding, with a rhythm that seemed to match the flashing of the lightning that split the sky around me. I stood on the crown of the Colossus, on the highest point of the highest structure in this land of giants and ruins, and I raised my sword toward the heavens, feeling the power that flowed through its blade, the ancient purpose that had guided me from the very beginning. I drove the sword downward into the sigil, and the world exploded. Light burst from the wound, a pillar of radiance that shot upward into the storm clouds and seemed to tear the sky itself apart. The Colossus shuddered beneath my feet, its entire body convulsing with a violence that threw me from my perch and sent me tumbling down its face, bouncing off ledges and outcroppings, my fingers scrabbling desperately for any handhold that might slow my descent. I fell and fell and fell, watching the structure collapse around me, watching the final Colossus crumble into dust and rubble and fragments of ancient stone. I hit the ground hard, harder than I had ever hit anything in my life, and I felt something break inside me, something essential, something that I knew would never be whole again. I lay there in the rain, surrounded by the ruins of the 16th Colossus, staring up at the sky that was beginning to clear, watching the clouds part to reveal the pale light of the sun that hung eternally above this land. I had done it. I had felled all 16 Colossi. I had broken all 16 seals. The power that had been divided and imprisoned for so many ages was now free, flowing back toward the temple, back toward Dorming, back toward the entity that had promised to restore my beloved to life in exchange for my service. The dark tendrils came for me then, more of them than ever before, a swarm of shadows that descended from the sky and rose from the earth and converged on my broken body from every direction. They passed through me, into me, filled me with a coldness so profound that it seemed to extinguish whatever warmth remained in my soul. And as the darkness claimed me, as consciousness faded and the world dissolved into nothing, I heard Dorman's voice one final time, speaking words that I could not quite understand, making promises that I could no longer evaluate or resist. I had won. I had completed the task. My beloved would wake, and all of this would finally be over. These were my last thoughts before the darkness swallowed me completely. When awareness returned, it came slowly, like the gradual brightening of the sky before dawn. I was lying on something hard and cold, a surface that I recognized through the fog of my confusion as the stone floor of the temple. My body felt strange, different, as though it belonged to someone else, as though I was inhabiting a vessel that had been altered in ways I could not yet comprehend. I tried to move my hand, and it obeyed, but the motion was wrong somehow, too slow, too heavy, accompanied by a sound of grinding and scraping that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside my own flesh. I opened my eyes and saw the ceiling of the temple far above me, its surface obscured by shadows that moved and writhed like living things. The figures that had surrounded me before were gone, vanished, absorbed back into whatever darkness had spawned them. And the temple itself seemed different, seemed larger, as though the walls had retreated to accommodate something that had grown beyond their original capacity to contain. I turned my head and saw her. My beloved lay on the altar, her eyes closed once more, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of natural sleep, rather than the shallow uncertainty of the half-death that had claimed her for so long. Color had returned to her cheeks, warmth to her skin, life to every aspect of her being that had been cold and still and fading for what felt like an eternity. She was alive, truly, completely, undeniably alive. I tried to call her name, tried to rise and go to her, tried to reach out and touch her face and feel the warmth of her breath against my skin. But my body would not obey. My limbs were too heavy, too strange, too fundamentally altered to respond to the commands of my mind. And when I finally managed to lift my hand into my field of vision, I understood why. My skin had turned dark, almost black, with a texture that resembled stone more than flesh. My fingers had elongated, had grown thick and gnarled like the roots of ancient trees. And when I touched my face, I felt ridges and protrusions that had not been there before, features that spoke of a transformation so profound that I could barely recognize myself as human anymore. Dorman's voice filled the temple, and now I understood the truth that had been hidden from me since the beginning. The power that had been sealed within the Colossi was not simply magical energy, not simply a force that could be wielded and directed toward any purpose. It was Dorman itself, divided and imprisoned, scattered across the 16 giants as a way of containing an entity that could not be destroyed, but could not be allowed to remain whole. And by releasing that power, by breaking all 16 seals, I had not simply freed Dorman to fulfill its promise. I had given it a vessel, a body, a host through which it could once again walk the earth in physical form. I was that vessel. I was that body. I was becoming Dorman, or Dorman was becoming me, and the distinction between us was dissolving with each passing moment. But even as horror washed over me, even as I understood the true nature of the bargain I had made, I could not bring myself to regret what I had done, because she was alive. My beloved was alive. She would wake, and she would breathe, and she would walk out of this temple into a world that still held beauty and wonder and possibility. Whatever happened to me, whatever I was becoming, it was a price worth paying. It was the price I had always been willing to pay. I heard voices then, coming from somewhere outside the temple, growing louder as they approached. Human voices, speaking in a language I recognized, calling out commands and warnings to one another. And I heard hoofbeats, many of them, the sound of riders approaching at speed, the sound of people who had come to this forbidden land with purpose and determination. The temple doors burst open, and light flooded into the space, harsh and blinding after so long in the shadows. I saw figures silhouetted against the brightness, men in robes carrying weapons that glinted with a familiar light, swords forged from the same ancient metal as the blade I had carried throughout my journey, and at their head a man whose face was obscured by a mask, whose bearing spoke of authority and power, whose voice rang out with a command that echoed off the walls of the temple. They had come to stop what I had started. They had come to prevent the release of Dormin, to seal away the power that I had so painstakingly freed. But they were too late. The seals were broken, the Colossi were dead, and the transformation was already underway. There was nothing they could do except bear witness to the consequences of their failure to keep this land and its secrets hidden from those who would seek to exploit them. I rose to my feet, and I towered over them. I rose and rose and rose, my body expanding, transforming, becoming something vast and terrible and ancient. The ceiling of the temple cracked and crumbled as I grew, unable to contain what I was becoming, unable to hold the power that was flowing into me from every corner of this cursed land. And I felt Dorman's consciousness merging with my own, felt its thoughts becoming my thoughts, its desires becoming my desires, its ancient rage at the imprisonment it had endured for so many centuries, becoming a fire that burned in the core of my being. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the tide of alien thoughts and feelings, I could still feel myself. I could still remember who I was, why I had come here, what I had sacrificed everything to achieve. I could still see my beloved lying there on the altar, still and peaceful, on the verge of waking, and I knew, with a certainty that transcended the chaos that was consuming my mind, that I had to protect her. I had to keep her safe from the violence that was about to erupt, from the men who had come with their swords and their righteous anger, from the consequences of the choices I had made in her name. The masked man raised his weapon and began to chant, words of power that seemed to pull at the fabric of reality itself, that seemed to create a force that pushed against the expansion of my new form. Other men joined him, adding their voices to the incantation, creating a wall of sound and light that pressed against me from all sides. I roared, a sound that was not human, that could not have come from any human throat, and I felt Dorman's rage surge through me, demanding that I destroy these interlopers, that I crush them beneath my feet and scatter their remains across the ruins of this temple. But I held back, even as my body grew beyond all reason, even as my mind fragmented and reformed into something I no longer recognized. I held back, because she was there, my beloved, lying just a few feet from where the men stood with their chanting and their swords. And I would not harm her. I would not risk her life, not after everything I had done to save it, not after every piece of myself that I had given to bring her back from the darkness. The chanting reached its climax, and a beam of light shot from the masked man's sword, piercing my chest, filling me with a pain so vast and terrible that it seemed to eclipse everything else in the universe. I felt Dorman scream inside me, felt its power begin to drain away, felt my body start to collapse as the force that had sustained its impossible growth was stripped away piece by piece. I was shrinking, I was dying, I was being unmade, torn apart by forces that I could not resist, could not fight, could not even understand. And as my consciousness faded, as the darkness closed in around me for what I knew would be the final time, I saw her, my beloved. Her eyes were open, her lips were moving. She was looking around the temple with an expression of confusion and wonder, trying to understand where she was, how she had come to be there, what was happening around her. And for one brief, perfect moment, her gaze found mine, and I saw recognition in her eyes, recognition and love and something that might have been gratitude. She was alive. She was awake. She was looking at me with the same warmth that had made me fall in love with her in the first place, the same warmth that had driven me across the bridge and into this land of giants, the same warmth that had sustained me through every battle and every sacrifice and every moment of doubt and despair. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The darkness swallowed me, and I fell. There is a kind of peace that exists beyond understanding, beyond thought, beyond the endless churning of the mind that defines so much of our waking existence. It is the peace of deep water, of starless skies, of the moment between one breath and the next, when the body forgets that it needs to continue breathing at all. It is the peace of surrender, of release, of finally letting go of everything that we have held so tightly for so long. And it was into this peace that I fell, tumbling through darkness that was not frightening but welcoming, sinking into depths that were not cold but warm, dissolving into a silence that was not empty but full, so impossibly full, of everything I had ever been and everything I would never be again. I do not know how long I drifted in that void. Time had ceased to have meaning long before, and here, in this place beyond places, even the concept of duration seemed absurd, a relic of a world that I had left behind forever. There was only the darkness, and the warmth, and the slow unwinding of everything that had made me who I was. Memories rose and faded like bubbles in still water. Emotions flickered and died like candles in a gentle breeze. And through it all, I felt myself becoming lighter, becoming less, becoming nothing more than a whisper of consciousness in an ocean of eternal night. But even in that darkness, even in that dissolution, there was something that remained. A spark, a fragment, a tiny piece of who I had been that refused to fade no matter how deeply I sank into the void. It was not my name, for names had lost their meaning. It was not my memories, for memories had become distant and dreamlike, stories told about someone I had once known rather than experiences I had lived. It was something simpler, something more fundamental, something that existed at the very core of what it meant to be alive. It was love, love for her, for my beloved, for the woman whose face I could no longer quite picture, but whose presence I could still feel like warmth against my skin on a cold night. Love for the life we had shared, for the moments of joy and sorrow and quiet contentment that had defined our years together. Love for the future we had imagined, the dreams we had dreamed, the children we had hoped to raise, and the home we had hoped to build, and the peaceful old age we had hoped to share, sitting together on a porch somewhere, watching the sunset, holding hands as we had held hands so many times before. That love anchored me. That love held me together when everything else was falling apart. That love kept the spark of my consciousness alive, even as the darkness pressed in from all sides, even as the void demanded my complete and total surrender. And then, slowly, impossibly, I began to rise. It was not a physical sensation, not a movement through space in any direction that could be measured or described. It was more like waking from a dream, like the gradual return of awareness that comes when sleep releases its hold and the world begins to reassemble itself around you. I felt weight return to limbs that had been weightless, felt solidity return to a body that had been formless, felt the familiar constraints of flesh and bone close around me like a garment that I had forgotten I was wearing. I opened my eyes, and I saw light. It was not the harsh, piercing light of the sun, not the cold, pale light that had illuminated the land of the Colossus. It was a soft, gentle light, golden and warm, the kind of light that filtered through windows on lazy afternoon and painted everything it touched with a glow of peace and contentment. I blinked, trying to understand what I was seeing, trying to make sense of a world that seemed impossibly different from the one I had left behind. I was lying in water, shallow water, that lapped gently against my skin and reflected the light in rippling patterns across the walls and ceiling of the space that surrounded me. It was a pool, I realized, a pool in the center of a chamber that seemed to be part of the temple but also somehow separate from it, a hidden space that had existed beneath the structure all along, waiting for this moment, waiting for me. I tried to move, tried to sit up, tried to examine this new environment and understand how I had come to be here, but my body was strange, unfamiliar, smaller than it should have been, and weaker than I remembered. I looked down at my hands and saw that they were tiny, the hands of an infant, smooth and pink and unmarked by the scars and calluses that had accumulated over a lifetime of living. I had been reborn. The realization washed over me with a force that should have been overwhelming, but was instead strangely peaceful, strangely right. The darkness that had consumed me, the transformation that had twisted my body into something monstrous and alien, the death that had claimed me when the masked man's sword pierced my chest, all of it had led to this moment, to this pool, to this new beginning in a form that I did not recognize, but that was somehow, impossibly, still me. I heard a sound then, a soft padding of feet on stone, and I turned my head, my infant neck struggling with the unfamiliar weight of my skull, to see who was approaching, and there, emerging from the shadows at the edge of the chamber, was my horse. She was alive, wounded, limping, her coat matted with dust and blood, but alive. She had survived the journey, survived the battles, survived everything that this land had thrown at us. And now, she was here, standing at the edge of the pool, looking down at me with those warm, patient eyes that had guided me through so much darkness. I tried to call to her, tried to make some sound that would let her know I was still here, still myself, still the person she had carried so faithfully across this land of giants and ruins. But all that emerged was a cry, a thin, wavering sound that was the only voice this new body knew how to make. And yet somehow she understood. She lowered her great head and nuzzled me gently, her breath warm against my tiny face, her presence a comfort that transcended the boundaries of form and species and all the other divisions that normally separated one being from another. We were still together. After everything, we were still together. I heard another sound then, footsteps again, but lighter this time, more hesitant. And when I turned my head, I saw her, my beloved. She stood at the entrance to the chamber, her white cloth replaced by a simple dress that someone must have given her, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face marked by confusion and wonder and something that might have been fear. She was looking at the pool, at the water, at the infant floating in its center with a horse standing guard beside it. And she was trying to understand, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to reconcile the world she had woken into with the world she remembered from before. I wanted to call her name. I wanted to tell her that I was here, that I had done everything for her, that every sacrifice and every battle and every piece of myself that I had given had been for this moment, for the chance to see her alive and well and standing in the light. But I had no words, only the cries of an infant, only the sounds that this new body could make. And so I simply looked at her with all the love that remained in my transformed heart, and hoped that somehow, some way she would understand. She approached slowly, carefully, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the stone as she entered the pool and waded toward me. Her eyes were fixed on my face, searching for something, looking for some sign of recognition, some indication of who or what I was. And when she finally reached me, when she bent down and lifted me from the water with hands that trembled slightly but held me with infinite gentleness, I saw the moment when understanding dawned. She gasped, a soft sound that echoed off the walls of the chamber, and her grip tightened around my small body. She had seen something in my eyes, something that spoke of who I had been, something that told her the truth, that words could never have conveyed. And she began to cry, tears streaming down her cheeks and falling onto my face like rain, like the gentle rain that had fallen during the battle with the final Colossus, like the rain that had washed away so much blood and so much pain and so much of the world that had existed before. She held me against her chest, against the heart that was beating strong and steady now, the heart that I had sacrificed everything to restart. And she whispered words that I could barely hear, words of love and gratitude and sorrow and hope, words that wove together into a melody that was more beautiful than any music I had ever known. We stayed like that for a long time, the two of us, in the golden light of that hidden chamber, with my horse standing patient guard at the edge of the pool. The world outside continued to exist, continued to turn, continued to move through its cycles of day and night and season and year. But for us, there was only this moment, this connection, this impossible reunion that defied every law of nature and every expectation of what was possible. I do not know how we left that place. I do not know how we crossed the bridge that separated the land of the Colossi from the world beyond, or how we found our way back to the life that had been interrupted by death and grief and desperate journeys into forbidden realms. The memories of those days are fragmented, dreamlike, colored by the strange perspective of infant eyes that saw everything as new and wondrous and full of light. But I know that we made it. I know that we found our way home, or to a place that became home, a quiet corner of the world where the past could not reach us, and the future stretched out before us like a road without end. I know that she raised me, cared for me, loved me with the same devotion that I had shown when I crossed the bridge to bring her back. And I know that as I grew, as this new body matured and strengthened and learned to navigate the world, the memories of who I had been began to fade, began to dissolve into the mists of early childhood, began to become stories rather than experiences, legends rather than history. There are still moments, even now, when I catch glimpses of what came before, dreams that feel more like memories, images of vast creatures falling against pale skies, sensations of climbing and fighting and falling that have no explanation in the life I have lived since the pool. And sometimes, when the light is just right, when the sun hangs low on the horizon and paints the world in shades of gold and amber, I feel a stirring in my heart that speaks of love so vast and sacrifice so complete that it transcends the boundaries of individual existence. I am told that I was born with horns, small protrusions on my forehead that marked me as different, as other, as someone who did not quite belong to the ordinary world of ordinary people. I am told that she never minded, never treated me as anything less than perfect, never allowed anyone to make me feel ashamed of the signs of my unusual origin. And I am told that when people asked about my father, she would simply smile and say that he had loved me more than life itself, that he had given everything so that I could exist, that his spirit lived on in me, even though his body had long since returned to the earth. I do not know if she understood what had really happened. I do not know if she ever learned the full truth of my journey, of the Colossi I had felled, of the bargain I had made with the entity called Dorman. Perhaps some part of her remembered, some fragment of awareness that had lingered during the long sleep of her death, some whisper of knowledge that had passed between us in those final moments before the darkness claimed me. Or perhaps she simply accepted the miracle of my existence without needing to understand its origins, the way we accept so many miracles in life, the sunrise and the rainfall, and the beating of our own hearts. What I know, what I remember with a clarity that time has not diminished, is the love that drove me across the bridge, the love that sustained me through every battle, the love that anchored me in the void when everything else was being stripped away. That love did not die when my body transformed. That love did not fade when my memories dissolved into the mists of rebirth. That love remained constant and true, the one thread of continuity that connected who I had been to who I became, the foundation upon which this new life was built. And now, as I sit here in the quiet of the evening, as the light fades and the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, I find myself thinking about the land I left behind. I find myself wondering if the Colossi have returned, if new giants have risen from the earth to take the place of those I felled, if the cycle of imprisonment and release continues to turn, as it has turned since before human memory began. I find myself wondering about the temple at the heart of that forbidden realm, about the altar where my beloved lay in her endless sleep, about the pool of light where I was born again into this strange and beautiful world. But these are idle thoughts, the musings of a mind that has lived long enough to contemplate the mysteries that lie beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. They do not trouble me, do not fill me with longing or regret, for I have what I crossed the bridge to find. I have what I sacrificed everything to achieve. I have love and life, and the quiet contentment of days spent in the company of those I cherish. My horse lived for many years after our return, her wounds healing slowly but completely, her spirit undimmed by the trials she had endured. She would carry me on her back as I grew, just as she had carried me across the land of the Colossi, and there was something in the way she moved, something in the rhythm of her gait that felt like memory, like the echo of journeys we had taken together in a life that no longer quite existed. When she finally passed, peacefully, in a meadow full of wildflowers, I wept for her, as I had wept for nothing else since my rebirth, and I buried her beneath a tree that overlooked the valley where we had made our home. My beloved lived longer still, growing old with a grace that made her more beautiful with each passing year rather than less. We never spoke directly of what had happened, never discussed the details of my journey or the price I had paid to bring her back. But there was an understanding between us, a depth of connection that did not require words, a bond that had been forged in the darkness between death and life and could not be broken by anything as trivial as the passage of time. When she finally passed, it was in her sleep, with a smile on her face and my hand in hers. I sat with her for a long time after, watching the light move across her features as the sun rose and set and rose again, remembering all the moments we had shared and all the moments we had been given because of choices made in a land that existed beyond the edge of maps and memory. And when I finally let her go, when I finally released her hand and allowed the world to continue turning, I felt no grief, no despair, only a profound and peaceful gratitude for the gift of the years we had been given together. I am old now myself, older than I ever imagined I would become, and the end of my own journey approaches with the slow inevitability of sunset at the close of a long and beautiful day. I do not fear it. How could I fear something I have already experienced, something I have already passed through and emerged from transformed? Death holds no terror for one who has walked in its shadow and returned bearing the scars of that passage. And besides, I know that she is waiting for me. I know that somewhere beyond the boundary that separates this world from whatever lies beyond, she is there, patient and loving, ready to welcome me home. Just as I crossed the bridge to bring her back, just as I felled 16 giants and sacrificed everything I was for the chance to see her smile again, she will be there when I finally close my eyes for the last time and allow the darkness to carry me wherever it will. This is the truth that my journey taught me, the wisdom that I carry in my heart as I approach the end of my days. Love does not end with death. Love does not bow to the laws of nature or the dictates of fate. Love is stronger than Colossi, deeper than forbidden lands, more enduring than the memory of the civilizations that built the temples and the bridges and the monuments that still stand in that place beyond the edge of the world. Love is the one thing that survives, the one thing that transcends, the one thing that makes all the suffering and all the sacrifice worthwhile. I crossed the bridge for love. I felled the giants for love. I gave everything I was and everything I might have become for love. And in the end, love gave me back more than I ever could have imagined, more than I ever would have dared to hope for in my darkest moments of grief and despair. The night deepens around me now, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, in patterns that have not changed since the world was young. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, casting a warm glow across the room where I sit, remembering, reflecting, preparing for the sleep that will soon claim me. And as my eyes grow heavy, as the weight of years settles over me like a blanket woven from all the moments I have lived, I find myself at peace with what I did, at peace with what I became, at peace with the choices I made and the prices I paid and the life I was given in return. There are places in this world that exist beyond the reach of maps, beyond the memory of those who once walked their paths, beyond even the fading whispers of time itself. I have been to such a place. I have walked its empty plains and climbed its silent giants and stood in its temple while the shadows gathered and the darkness closed in. And I have returned, transformed, renewed, carrying with me a truth that no words can fully express, but that my heart knows with perfect clarity. Love is the bridge between worlds. Love is the sword that pierces the darkness. Love is the pool of light where broken things are made whole again. And love, in the end, is the only thing that truly matters. The fire dies, the stars wheel on, and I close my eyes, and I let go, and I drift toward the peace that has been waiting for me since the very beginning. The peace that exists beyond understanding, beyond thought, beyond the endless churning of the mind that defines so much of our waking existence. It is the peace of deep water, of starless skies, of the moment between one breath and the next. It is the peace of surrender, of release, of finally coming home after a journey that has taken a lifetime and more. It is the peace of love fulfilled, of sacrifice rewarded, of a story that has found its ending at last. And it is beautiful. It is so very, very beautiful. Rest now. Let the silence hold you. Let the darkness comfort you. Let the weight of the world fall away and drift, drift, drift into the gentle embrace of sleep. For you have traveled far, and you have carried much, and you have earned this moment of stillness, this breath of peace, this soft surrender to the night that waits with open arms to receive you. The giants have fallen, the beloved has awakened, and somewhere, in a land beyond the edge of memory, a horse stands patient in a meadow of eternal grass, waiting for the rider who will one day return. Sleep now, sleep, and dream of Colossus walking beneath pale skies, and of love that crosses every bridge, and of the light that waits at the end of every journey, warm and golden and full of promise. Sleep. You are safe. You are loved. You are home.